Welcome to another deep dive, everybody. Today we're going to be looking at something that I find really fascinating, and that's the attempted assassination of Ronald Reagan.
Hmm.
Yeah, and we're going to be looking at an episode of the American History Tellers podcast,
Okay.
and it was a really, really good one. So we're going to try to kind of unpack not just what happened, but like the lasting impact.
Right.
You know,
There's the ripple effects.
The ripple effects,
Yeah.
yeah, on his presidency, on the Secret Service, on the legal system, on just,
On America.
yeah, on America.
Okay.
So let's start with the setting.
Okay.
It's 1981. Reagan's this newly elected president,
Right.
and things aren't going great.
Yeah, he's facing a lot of headwinds. His approval ratings are really low.
Yeah.
A lot of criticism coming from both sides.
Yeah, and on March 30th, he's at a gala, and get this,
Or is he?
at Ford's Theater.
Oh, wow.
I know.
Talk about irony.
Right, like the site of Lincoln's assassination.
Yeah. You almost wonder if that crossed anyone's mind when they were planning this event.
You would think so. Right,
Yeah.
like, is anybody even thinking about this?
Right. Meanwhile, you've got the Secret Service.
Right.
An organization that's come a long way from just, dealing with counterfeit money
Yeah.
to like this huge force that's responsible for the president's safety.
And they had prepared.
Extensively. I mean,
Yeah.
they went through everything.
Yeah, they had really thought it out.
But sometimes
Yeah.
even the best laid plans,
Right? You can't.
you can't account for everything.
Yeah.
There's always that element of the unpredictable, the
The human factor.
the human factor.
And that comes in the form of this guy, John Hinckley Jr., 25 years old.
25.
Yeah. Wealthy family.
Yeah.
Seemingly obsessed with.
Jodie Foster
Yeah.
and the movie Taxi Driver.
And like his obsession is like deeply troubling.
Yeah, I mean, his plan was to emulate Travis Bickle,
Right.
the anti-hero of the movie.
But
And he believed that by committing this shocking act of violence, he would somehow win Jodie Foster's affection.
it's a very like twisted logic.
Oh, absolutely.
Mm.
I mean, to think that violence could be the answer to
Right.
something like that is
He's prepared. He's got a 22 caliber revolver.
loaded with exploding bullets.
I know. And originally his target was actually President Carter.
But then Reagan's public appearance
Right.
presented this opportunity
All right.
that he couldn't resist.
It's like almost like a chance to act out this fantasy.
Right. It's all very warped and twisted.
So picture this. Reagan is leaving the Hilton,
Okay.
walking through a crowd of supporters.
Right.
Hinckley's kind of blended in,
Just another face in the crowd.
and then 6 shots ring out.
It's just like that. Chaos erupts.
Sandemonia.
Secret
and
Service agents jump into action.
people are diving for cover.
Hinckley's just standing there.
Yeah.
Gun's empty.
Yeah.
Limo speeds away. And the question on everyone's mind
Yeah.
is the president hit?
So you've got Secret Service agent Jerry Parr.
Hmm.
He's alone with Reagan in this speeding limo.
Right.
And he sees blood.
He notices Reagan's having trouble breathing.
And he's got a choice to make.
Right. What a decision.
White House or the hospital.
I mean, does he prioritize getting the president to safety?
Right.
Or does he get him immediate medical attention?
Because either one has huge risks.
Oh, absolutely.
But he chooses the hospital.
A decision that very well may have saved Reagan's life.
Yeah, they raced to George Washington University Hospital.
And the medical team's just thrust into this chaotic situation.
Reagan is pale. Blood pressure's dropping.
They can't find any visible wounds.
And they think initially.
Heart attack.
Yeah.
It's not until later
Right.
that they discover
The tiny bullet hole. The collapsed lung.
internal bleeding.
I mean, things escalate quickly.
Oh, yeah.
And then news breaks.
The White House.
The White House is in chaos.
Total chaos.
Press conferences are being held.
But you've got conflicting reports.
Yeah.
Spokespeople who lack experience.
Yeah.
It's just adding to the confusion.
That's a power vacuum.
All right, the president's in surgery.
The vice president's unavailable.
There's even talk of the 25th Amendment,
Right.
this protocol for transferring power.
Yeah, and into this walks Secretary of State Alexander Haig.
Former military man.
He wants to project strict
And,
stability.
Yeah, he wants to take control
And so he makes this mistake.
of saying, I'm in control.
Right, which
Yeah.
directly contradicts the constitutional line of succession.
It's such a misstep.
Yeah.
But meanwhile, back in the operating room,
Yeah.
Dr. Benjamin Aaron
He's got this daunting task
of finding the bullet.
lodged in Reagan's lung.
Reagan's losing blood. The bullet is proving elusive.
It's tense.
And then
They
finally,
find it
they find it.
flattened from a ricochet.
And thankfully,
It didn't explode.
it's incredible. He
A
survived.
series of what ifs.
Yeah.
Each one potentially fatal.
Yeah. And then the recovery is remarkable.
Reagan signing legislation from his hospital bed.
Projecting this strength and resilience,
And when he returns to the public eye,
his approval ratings soar.
it's really interesting.
It's like the assassination attempt
Yeah.
actually strengthens his political standing.
Makes you wonder why.
I mean, was it just sympathy?
Right.
Or was there something more?
Maybe a mix of things.
Right.
Relief that he survived.
Yeah.
Admiration for his toughness.
Maybe even this subconscious
Yeah.
rallying around the flag effect.
Right. And then you can't discount that image of him, wounded but still working.
It's a powerful image.
Yeah. So while Reagan's recovering,
Mhm.
the legal system is gearing up for this whole other drama.
Right. The trial of John Hinckley Jr.,
His defense team's going with an insanity plea.
claiming that his obsession with Jodie Foster.
Drove him to do this.
Yeah.
But how do you prove something like insanity?
It's one of the most challenging aspects of criminal law.
Yeah. And a key piece of evidence.
Emerges.
Hinckley's unmailed letter to Jodie Foster.
A confession.
Yeah. It lays bare his motives.
His mental state.
And the jury delivers this verdict.
That shocks the nation.
Not guilty by reason of insanity.
Public outrage is immediate.
People see it as a failure of justice.
And it raises all these profound questions about the legal system.
About the definition of insanity.
The balance between accountability.
And recognizing mental illness.
Yeah, it's a verdict that has lasting repercussions.
But we'll get into those in part 2. That not guilty by reason of insanity verdict. I mean, wow. Just the impact that must have had on people.
Oh, it was huge.
Yeah.
You have this guy who tried to kill the president, and he's essentially walking free. It really shook people's faith in the justice system. Like, is this really justice?
Yeah, it sounds like the Hinckley case really forced everyone to start thinking about that whole insanity defense thing.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It exposed this real fundamental tension in the law. How do you balance holding people accountable with recognizing that mental illness can be a factor? Like, where do you draw the line?
Right. And in this case, it's even more complicated because of that whole Jodie Foster obsession. I mean, trying to win someone's love through an assassination attempt? That's just bizarre.
It really defies logic. And it fueled this fear that the insanity defense was this loophole, a way for criminals to get away with anything.
So what happened after that? Did all that public anger actually lead to any changes?
It did. There was so much pressure to do something. So in 1984, Reagan signed the Insanity Defense Reform Act.
Interesting. What did that change?
Well, for one thing, it shifted the burden of proof. Before the act, the prosecution had to prove the defendant was sane. But the new law put that burden on the defense. They had to prove insanity.
Wow, that's a big shift.
It is. It made it much harder to use insanity as a defense.
Oh, okay.
And they also narrowed the definition of insanity itself. It had to be about the defendant's ability to understand right from wrong.
So in a way, the Hinckley case, even though it was this terrible thing, it kind of pushed things forward.
It did. It was this catalyst for legal reform.
Yeah.
But the impact went beyond the courts, too. The Secret Service had to really look at themselves and see what went wrong.
Yeah, I bet they had some serious soul searching to do. Like, how could this happen? Where were the gaps in their security?
Exactly. They had to analyze every detail, figure out how to prevent something like this from ever happening again.
So what did they change? Did they revamp everything?
Pretty much. I mean, the most obvious change was that they created this bigger security bubble around the president. The days of just casually shaking hands in a crowd, those were over.
Yeah, I guess that makes sense from a security standpoint, but
Yeah.
it also creates this distance between the president and the people.
It's a trade-off, for sure. But they had to prioritize safety, even if it meant less accessibility.
Right. And did they make any other big changes?
They invested heavily in technology. No metal detectors, better communication systems, more thorough background checks on anyone near the president. Basically a whole security upgrade.
Wow, a total overhaul. And what about training for the agents?
Oh yeah, they stepped that up big time.
Right.
More focus on rapid response, threat identification, close protection tactics. They had to be ready for anything.
It makes you wonder what that constant state of high alert did to the relationship between the Secret Service and the president.
You're right, it must have been intense. I mean, imagine being surrounded by that level of security all the time. It could feel isolating. But on the other hand, the president has to trust them completely with his life.
It's almost like this unspoken bond built on trust and shared responsibility.
Exactly. And you could argue that the assassination attempt, even though it was terrible, actually strengthened that bond. Reagan continued to express respect for the agents even after being shot.
That says a lot. And speaking of people affected by that day, we can't forget about James Brady. He was seriously injured.
Yeah, it's a tragic reminder of the human cost of that day. Brady was shot in the head. He survived, but had permanent brain damage.
It's amazing that he survived. And what's incredible is that he and his wife Sarah became these powerful advocates for gun control.
They did. They channeled their pain into a fight for a safer America.
And that ultimately led to the Brady Bill in 1993.
Yep, it mandated background checks for all firearm purchases from licensed dealers. A huge step forward.
It's amazing to think that something good came out of something so awful.
It's a testament to the power of resilience and hope.
So we've seen changes in the legal system, security protocols, even gun control. What else did this event change about America?
I think it also changed how we view the presidency. Before that, I think there was this sense that the president was untouchable,
No.
invincible. But seeing Reagan shot on live TV, it shattered that illusion.
It humanized him in a way.
Exactly. And it reminded everyone that even in a democracy, violence can happen.
It must have been a shock for the whole country. Like, we came so close to losing a president.
Absolutely.
Hmm.
And while everyone was relieved that Reagan recovered, that sense of vulnerability lingered, I think.
So how did this affect Reagan himself? Do you think it changed how he led?
It's hard to say for sure. Some historians think he became more cautious, more aware of the risks of being in public.
Did he ever say anything about being afraid after that?
Not publicly. Reagan was always optimistic, projecting strength and determination, even after being shot.
But inside it must have had some effect.
I'm sure it did. Trauma like that leaves a mark.
Hmm.
But he never let it show publicly. He kept pushing his agenda. And actually, the assassination attempt seemed to make people support him even more.
Interesting how something so negative could have that effect.
Shows how charismatic he was, how he connected with people. They saw him as a survivor, a fighter.
So looking back on all of this, what are the big takeaways? What should people really remember about this whole thing?
I think the Reagan assassination attempt shows how interconnected everything is. This one event had repercussions that went far beyond that day. It affected the law, security, gun control, and even how we see the presidency.
It reminds us that history isn't just a straight line. It's more like this tangled web of choices and consequences.
Exactly. And while we can't predict what's going to happen, we can learn from the past. By understanding events like this, we can understand the forces that shape our world.
And in the last part of our deep dive, we're going to look at John Hinckley Jr. His story didn't end with that not guilty verdict. He was confined for decades and then eventually released. It brings up a whole other set of questions about justice, mental health, and rehabilitation. Okay, so we've talked about the shooting, the politics, the wider impact. And now we got to talk about John Hinckley Jr. What happens to him after that not guilty verdict?
Well, remember, he doesn't go to prison. He's sent to St. Elizabeth's. It's a psychiatric hospital in D.C. So the focus is on treatment, not punishment. The hope is that he can be rehabilitated.
I see. So what was life like for him there? Was he just kind of locked away, forgotten?
Not exactly. I mean, the public was very aware of him. His case was constantly being reviewed by the courts, by mental health experts. He got therapy medication, and they were always evaluating him, assessing his mental state and if he was still a danger.
Makes sense. So I imagine there were a lot of debates about his case. Like, was he really insane? Was he getting better? And could he ever be safe to let back into society?
Exactly. Those are the big questions. And there were no easy answers. Mental health is really complicated, and predicting violence is almost impossible.
Yeah, it's one thing to say how someone is right now, but to say how they'll act in the future.
It's incredibly difficult.
Yeah.
And in Hinckley's case, it was even more complex because of the Jodie Foster obsession. It raised questions about what was really driving him. Was it mental illness or this dangerous obsession?
Right. Did Hinckley ever say he was sorry for what he did? Did he acknowledge the pain he caused?
There were reports of him expressing remorse. He wrote apology letters to the victims and their families.
But I bet people were pretty skeptical. Like, was he really sincere or just trying to manipulate the system?
It's hard to know for sure, especially with the Jodie Foster thing still there. Some people believed him. Others thought it was just a way to get out sooner.
So how did he eventually get released? Was it a sudden thing or a slow process?
Very slow. It involved legal battles and small steps toward freedom. Over the years, he started getting supervised visits outside the hospital, then longer stays with his mother in Virginia.
I'm sure those visits came with a lot of rules.
Oh, yeah. The court had tons of conditions to make sure he wouldn't be a danger. He had to go to therapy, take his meds, stay away from the media, Jodie Foster, and the victims' families.
It sounds like they were trying to walk this tightrope between giving him some freedom, but also keeping people safe.
That's exactly what it was.
Yeah.
And every time he got a bit more freedom, it sparked this whole debate again. Was it the right decision? Was he really better? Could someone who tried to kill the president ever be trusted?
I remember when he was finally released unconditionally in 2022, It was big news, so why did they decide to let him go completely?
The judge said that Hinckley, who was 67 by then, was no longer a danger to himself or others. This was based on years of psychiatric reports, his good behavior, and the fact that he hadn't been violent during his conditional release.
So after more than 40 years, the man who tried to assassinate a president was free. It's a pretty complicated outcome.
It is, and it's still controversial. Some people see it as proof that rehabilitation can work. Others see it as a failure of the justice system to hold him truly accountable.
It makes you wonder about Hinckley's life after release. Did he try to build a new life, or was he defined by what he did?
He said he wanted to be a musician. He even released some songs online, tried to book shows. But there was a lot of backlash, and it didn't really work out.
So even though he was legally free, he couldn't escape his past.
It shows that some actions have consequences that last a lifetime, no matter what happens legally or how much someone tries to change.
So we've covered a lot in this deep dive. It's clear that the attempted assassination of Ronald Reagan wasn't just some isolated event. It sparked changes in security, the law, our ideas about the presidency. It also shows how individual choices can have these huge ripple effects on history.
And what's really interesting is that the story is still going on.
Yeah.
The debates about Hinckley's release, the impact of the security changes, the gun control debate, it's all still relevant today.
It's a reminder that history isn't just something in the past. It's a living thing that shapes our present and our future.
Exactly. It's full of twists and turns. And it makes us think about things like power human behavior, the search for justice in a world that doesn't always have easy answers. Thanks for listening.